Hello everybody, this is video number 3 in the 5 areas of jazz study series. Today we're talking about jazz technique. Technique is the second area of study that I teach. And I'm going to emphasize, once again, I emphasized it in the listening video, these are not sequential. You don't do listening first and then technique. All 5 of these areas are lifelong pursuits. For as long as you're trying to improvise as a jazz player, all 5 of these areas are supposed to be worked on at the same time. Sometimes you will stress one and then kind of, let other stuff kind of go a little bit. There's a shifting of focus as you go, but should never completely give up any one of these 5. And the technique falls in that same category. So let's talk about technique. For the purpose of my system, these 5 areas, technique is only scales, arpeggios, and chromatic patterns. That's what I consider technique. And you know what? I'm going to be very, very, very clear about this. These are not practiced so that you can use them in your solos. That is not how it works. We do not practice this stuff to be used as material in your improvisation. And I'm very serious about that. The technique that we gain from doing these exercises, and it's all exercises, by the way. I do believe after you've finished exercises that you should do some free improv using those materials after the exercises. I don't do that as often as I would like to. I forget sometimes. But I do think that's a great practice. But no, this is not material for you to use. Now, if something like comes out and you can later analyze it and say, oh, this is that scale and oh, that is that pattern, that's fine. I'm not saying don't ever play this stuff in your solos. I'm saying where your mind is, where your heart is, you don't go into a jazz improvisation saying, oh, I'm going to use that scale here and I'm going to use this scale there. I'm extremely opposed to that kind of improvisation because it produces unmusical results. And we will talk about that in the next few videos because it's when we start talking about the language and that stuff, that's when you really understand what jazz music is. I'm not going to get into the argument what is jazz, what it's not and stuff like that. But I know what music is. And when you play a bunch of scales in your solos, that's what it sounds like, is a bunch of scales. And so improv is kind of interesting because where your heart is, where your mind is, those two things, that's what comes out. And if you're thinking scales, that's what comes out, scales. If you're thinking patterns, that's what comes out, patterns. If you are thinking other things, that's what comes out. And those other things are more important in the actual improv. So then why are we even doing the technique stuff anyway? The purpose of the technique is to make it easier to do what we're doing. If you practice systematically every scale, every arpeggio, there's no such thing as every, but you get my point, right? Every chromatic possible pattern, then the stuff that does come up as you're improvising becomes easier to navigate. You can sort of compare the technique stuff in the context of jazz. You can sort of compare the technique stuff to doing push-ups. If you're, let's say you're a soccer player or a football player or a basketball player, push-ups, pull-ups, sit-ups, those kind of exercises. Why do we do those? Weightlifting. Why do we do those? How does that make our sport better? Well, it makes it better because our muscles, our bodies are more prepared for the movements that have to be utilized during the sport. It's the same thing here. You know, jazz improv is spontaneous composition. If you are limited in your technique, then there's less for you to say. And now there are some people who oppose practicing scales at all. And they say that when you practice your scales, it makes you sound too technical. And I almost agree with them, except that I don't. Right? I agree with them that if you only ever practice scales, that's what I was talking about earlier. If you practice scales, then that's what comes out. And I think a lot of people interpret that as being too technical. And in other words, I don't think they're really saying what they mean. What they're saying is there's no music there. Okay? So yes, let's talk about this in more detail now. What scales? Obviously, you want to start with your major scales. All 12 of the major scales. When we're improvising, there are only 12 major scales. You know, you don't do C flat when you're improvising. I'm sorry. That's for reading. Not that you shouldn't be able to read C flat. But when you're improvising, there's only B. You don't do C flat too, okay? Let that sink in. I think for classical guys, you have to do both. The C and B, C flat and B, C sharp and D flat. But for us, there are only 12 keys. So we want to do all 12 of the major scales, all 12 of the harmonic minor. I teach my students all 12 of the melodic minor. The melodic minor is an extremely important scale in jazz, and we don't have time to go into that now. But if you had to choose, for example, between melodic minor and harmonic minor, you might want to choose the melodic minor, just because it's so important. You should also practice the symmetric scale. Oh wait, there's one more tertian. Don't forget the pentatonic. The pentatonic scale. So let's go again. Major, melodic minor, harmonic minor, pentatonic. Those are your 4 minimum on the tertian side. Then there's the symmetric scales. You should practice chromatic, whole tone. There's 2 whole tones. Diminished, there's 3 diminished. And if you want to do the advanced stuff, you can do the augmented scale and the tritone scale in that order. Optional scales you might want to learn can be the more exotic stuff. Like lately I've been working on what I call the double harmonic minor. Some people call it the Persian scale. Basically, it's a scale that has, it's like the harmonic minor, but it's got an F sharp. If you're in C, it's got an F sharp and the B natural. So it'll be C, D, E flat, F sharp, G, A flat, B natural, C. But that's after you've learned all those others. All right, that's a very important point to make there. Now, let's talk quickly about what scale we don't practice. If you're my student, you don't practice the blues scale. The blues is not a scale. I want that to sink in. The blues is not a scale. Don't approach the blues as a scale. Please, please, please don't do that. We also don't do the modes. Did you notice I didn't say Dorian, Phrygian, Lydian, Mixolydian? We don't practice those because the way you practice, if you practice from my system, you're covering all that anyway, so don't worry about it. Okay? The way my scales are laid out, I call them tonalization studies. The way my scales are laid out, we don't do the modes. And if you say, well, Mr. Lewis, how do we know what to play on a D minor chord? That's the 2 chord for C. So play C. All right? And there's more to that than just what I just said. It's a whole system, but that's where your mind needs to be if you're using my system. If you want to use everybody else's system, not everybody else, but what people are teaching out there, you would do Dorian for the D minor and Mixolydian for the G7. Yeah, I'm not into that. Not at all. I don't teach that. My students don't do that. Now, that said, I do tell my students that if you're in somebody's class and they're teaching that, then do that. There's nothing wrong with having the skill to do what they're saying to do. I just don't believe that it leads to jazz. That kind of practice does not enhance your jazz playing much at all. Compared to the stuff I'm going to give you, that reference the scale to the chord approach does not do much of anything for your jazz improvisation. So we don't practice the modes. Okay? Now let's look at the arpeggios. I use a sheet. I do it for the scales too, but the sheet for the arpeggios is more important because there's more of them. I have a sheet and the students are supposed to put the date. We only do, that's something I need to tell you. We only do one scale a day, by the way. One scale per day, not all the scales in one day. Trying to do all the scales in one day is sort of like saying, I'm going to learn 12 languages one word at a time. You're not going to remember anything that way. So if you do all of the scales every day, you're learning basically nothing. Finger technique is what you get out of that. One scale a day, 15 minutes a day on that one scale. You know where I got that from? I was in college at UTEP. I was in the music library listening to a Charlie Parker album. And the nice thing about LPs is there's so much material on the back of the album. And I'm reading through that, and it said that Charlie Parker used to practice 7 or 8 hours a day in one key. Wow. And that just opened my mind. That, people say blew my mind. That it was like a new world for me, because all I had done in my jazz up to that point was to do everything, run it through every key, every key, every key. My conclusion after living that way for like 5 years of my life is that all that gives you is finger technique and nothing here. And guess what? This is easy. This is hard. And you know what? When we talk about the technique, the jazz technique, we're not talking about your fingers. Your fingers, anybody can do that. We're talking about training your mind. Okay? The technique is not here, it's in here. I know that's a little bit too much for some people to handle, because they feel it in their fingers, but no, it's happening up here. And I can't explain it to you in a way right now with the time I have, in a way that can convince you. You almost have to just trust me on this. If you are a professional jazz musician and you know what I'm talking about, please make a comment below, because I don't have a quick way to say that. But yes, for the technique, it's up here. All right, so looking at the arpeggios, we're looking at arpeggios. We want to do all the triads. Once again, one triad a day. Not all the triads in one day. Now, we will get to doing all the triads in one day, and it's part of technique, but I consider those chromatic patterns. All the major triads up in half steps, all the major triads up in whole steps, all the major triads up in minor thirds. Those are chromatic patterns. And we still want to practice those. But you know what? Out of all the stuff I teach, that's the least effective in producing any results in your improvisation. So we still want to get there. But learning your triads first, patterns over triads. Learning that first is far, far more important than being able to do all the triads in chromatic sequences. Okay, so we want major, minor, diminished, augmented triads. And even sus if you want to do that too. Then we want to have major 7, minor 7, dominant 7, half diminished 7, diminished 7, augmented 7, and sus 7. If you practice all of those, one a day, that's the cool thing about this approach. You only do one a day. Yes, that means it takes like a whole year to get through all your arpeggios. But when you do one a day, your mind remembers it better. And the technique that you get from that is mind technique instead of finger technique. You know what happens when you only have finger technique? It creates in your improv musical gibberish. Stuff that doesn't make any sense. Because if your mind is not engaged on the actual materials, the note choices that you're playing, and it's just your fingers going, you're not speaking to the audience. All right? So that's the triads and so arpeggios. I consider them arpeggios even if it's 7 chords. In this area, I do not practice ninths and other extensions. And, you know, if all you do is technique, then you have to do that. If you're one of those people that is like all you do is scales and patterns and stuff, then you have to practice the nines. If you're doing my 5 areas, it becomes redundant and a huge waste of time. Not just because it's redundant, but because it just doesn't fit the system. And that's why I mean it's a huge waste of time. So, the chromatic patterns are basically any motif 2 to 7 notes. And you can move it up or down in half steps, move it up or down in whole steps. And if you do whole steps, do both whole steps. So like starting on C sharp. And then you can do minor thirds starting on C, C sharp, and D. Shouldn't be C sharp, D flat, right? And then major thirds, same thing, all starting on each one of those. And you're progressing. So if you're doing, for example, the 1, 2, 3, 5 pattern, going up. Now, for all of the technique, I prefer a sequence of patterns that is comprehensive. So, for example, that would have been the first one. When I come back down, I'm not flipping the pattern. I keep the pattern stays ascending. The next one I'll do, same pattern, but a different variation. All right? And then up one and down the other. And then reverse that, down the first one, up the next one. All right? So I do that same on the scales. I do that on the arpeggios. And now we're talking about the chromatic patterns. So that was a 1, 2, 3, 5 pattern up in whole steps. And like I said, whole steps, half steps, minor thirds, major thirds, and perfect fourths. So that same pattern can be very nice in perfect fourths. And you can mix that with descending ones and go through the cycle of fifths that way. Anyway, so that is the 3 areas of technique within the area of the 5 areas. So we want scales, and within the scales is tertian and symmetric. Then we have arpeggios, and then we have chromatic patterns. And, you know, with the chromatic patterns, the sky is the limit. So, and we consider that some of the most advanced stuff that we can do on the technical side of what we do, you know, with the scales and all that. I do want to caution you one more time, only because I see it so much. don't use these patterns and these scales and stuff as material for your solos. And you know, it does come out in your solos. And I think this is where we get it wrong. We look at what the jazz players are doing and we say, oh, he played thirds. So if I play thirds, then I'm playing jazz. And it doesn't work like that. Okay, I'm going to say that again. I'm sorry. Too many people are looking at it that way, and that's not music. Thinking about what scale you're going to play is cheating the audience from what you actually have to say. Yes, maybe what you have to say has thirds in it. But don't think about the thirds, think about what you have to say. We're going to get more into that in the next video. We're going to be talking about, and I think the next one is the most important of this series. The next video we're talking about the language. And a lot of what I'm saying in this video about what not to do, not to play scales in your solos and stuff like that. Because now you might be itching your head saying, what am I supposed to do then? Because that's what you've been taught, right? Do this scale, do that scale. The language will answer that question for you. Because I really think most of what we do when we improvise is language. And if you don't understand that part of it, most of what I have to teach outside of the language isn't going to make much sense at all. Okay? So, there you have it. We just finished talking about technique in jazz, the practicing part. And this really should be a daily effort. When I say daily, I don't mean every day. I really mean regular. I don't believe in practicing every day. And if you don't like that, fine. That's what I believe. And that's what I teach my students. I don't believe in practicing every day. So when I say daily in these videos or in my lessons or whatever, I don't mean daily. I mean regularly. And the scales, that's why I have in my routine books, the scales are actually in the routine books. Because that's how important. The scales actually don't fit in the routine. Scales aren't as physically oriented as the rest of what I teach in the routine. But I included them because they were so important. They need to be done every day. All right? And then remember what I said about every day. Okay, so I hope you understand what I'm saying. And if you are interested in how I practice the scales, there will be a video eventually about the tonalization studies and how they work, and you can do them yourself, or you can buy the book. There is a total tonalization study book, and there are other tonalization study ebooks out there too that I've written. So you can start looking for those. And that's a big part of the technique that I teach. And I practice myself that way too. All right? So that's the technique area, the number 2 area of the 5 areas. We've got 3 more to go. All right? Next one is language. God bless you. I'll see you on that next video.